panel. And so Sean Ye, you will kick it off, and we'll do some Q&A halfway through and then also at the end. So if you have any questions, hold them to the middle, and then we'll get your input. But without further ado, Sean.
Hello. Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sean. I'm from Providence Health and Services, or Providence St. Joseph Health. So before we start today, I'd like to start with why. I heard earlier on the panel, why am I here? So I am a program manager for our multi-site clinical trials and also our AI studies. We're looking into doing prospective clinical trials on AI. And at Providence, we make a promise. We make a promise to our caregivers. We call our staff and physicians caregivers, our patients. We make the same promise to you, and that's know me, care for me, ease my way. And so that answers why I'm here today. I believe that AI can help us know our patients and ourselves better. And if we know ourselves better and know our patients better, we'll be able to care for them more deeply. And of course, if we can do that, if we can achieve that with AI, we'll be able to ease their way and our way in more ways. And that's why AI, that's why I'm here. And another thing I like to do for panels, especially discussions of this type, something very, I'll say very theoretical, maybe even depending on who you talk to, controversial, maybe tense, is a obligation to dissent. So if there's something here that you don't agree with, maybe you have a different opinion, you feel strongly about it, you don't just have a right to dissent, you have an obligation to. And I welcome you, in fact, I implore you to do so throughout this discussion. So we're going to split this session into two parts. I know when I'm a participant, I don't like to wait to the end for Q&A, because then it's like, okay, I have one question and then another. So we're going to split it into two parts, part one, and then Q&A, and then part two, and we'll do another Q&A. In part one, we're going to start with why and what. In part two, we're going to answer exactly what the, well, it's not on here, but it's synthetic data in clinical trials, what could go wrong? We're going to answer that. We're going to discuss that and deep dive into that. So I don't believe we have Dr. Wang. Not yet. Okay, so Dr. Wang is a professor at Georgia Tech. We were going to start with why. We'll wait for that. We'll instead dive into what. So the first question we're going to, well, actually, before we do, I see your introductions here. Jumping ahead, let's go with introductions. You got to know me a little bit. Let's get to know our speakers, and we'll do this popcorn style. So pop.
Hey all, great to meet and great to have to be here. My name is Kees Janseen. I'm from the Netherlands, Amsterdam, from the startup Syntho. We build software to generate synthetic data. I have a background in the financial sector, worked there with the most privacy sensitive data. And in that role, always was trapped into actually getting access to the data with the data science team. I think 20-30% of my time was spent into getting access to the data we need to build data solutions for. And that was my motivation, that I felt like, okay, those data privacy regulations will only become stricter and stricter. The level of ambition to innovate with data will also become higher and higher. So we need to have smart solutions. And that was 2.5 years ago. And looking forward to deep dive into this topic today with you all.
Hi, everybody. My name is John Cordier. I'm really glad to be here. Glad Todd gave me the invite. Our company, Epistemix, we're a synthetic data generation company as well, but on a very different side. We're on the simulation side. So we start with a synthetic population that represents every single one of us as a computational agent. All people in the US are assigned households, schools, workplaces on our platform, and you get to build models to test behaviors to look at creating synthetic futures rooted in behavior, rooted in testing policies, testing strategies, and I'm really looking forward to the last question on the panel to tie it back to some of the other things that were discussed today. So Sean, back over to you.
And we have Dr. Wang joining us. Dr. Wang.
Hi everyone. I'm a professor in the Biomedical Engineering Department and Electrical and Computer Engineering at Georgia Institute of Technology and Emory University. I have been a professor after working in industry for several years. I used to work on multimedia computing for communication, but I have been working on the biomedical big data and AI with intelligent reality for the last 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Wang. Dr. Wang is joining us from Israel. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
I actually just
Go ahead, yeah.
to my room from Untitled Chapter.
So before we jump into the question, there were two things before I jump way ahead. I'm super excited for this conversation, is to understand our audience. So who among you have heard of synthetic data? Well, you heard from the other panel before, but synthetic, okay. Who have had hands-on with synthetic data? Okay, who has no idea what we're talking about? Okay, yeah, I'm with you. So let's explore together. We're gonna start there. So we're gonna start with the why synthetic data? And Dr. Wang, we're gonna go to you first. Why would we consider using synthetic data? If you could set the stage for us with that.
Okay, so in biomedical field, because a lot of time when we're trying a new drug, for example, or new therapy, so we want to ideally find out what are the patient subtyping, right? Which population subtype they belong to, because usually we have a heterogeneous population for any conditions. As a result of it, if you actually start using the real electronic medical record, there's a potential risk of having all the private information being disclosed. So it's very hard to develop a model for using a real large electronic medical record. So that's one scenario where you want to ideally generate a synthetic data. So that's one scenario, right? That's for privacy protection. Second scenario, we actually deal with rare diseases. For example, like a heart transplant patient, right? You have very few patients. If you're talking about using the machine learning big algorithm to develop an AI algorithm, you don't have enough samples. How do you actually develop the model that can actually be able to capture the property of that's a rare disease condition? That's where a second scenario, if you can use the synthetic data. Third scenario, that's actually for a case. For example, you want to try a new drug. For the new drug, doing the trial, during the preclinical, you do the animal study. If you want to try different drug dosage, how many the mice, rats, like rabbits, sometimes even pigs, the big one, you have to kill when you actually try so many different dosage. So those are the cases where you actually want to have a small real set of real data, but you want to extrapolate by generating synthetic data. So I just give us three scenarios of why you need a synthetic data in the biomedical application. I give three scenarios for that.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. So now for the third group, like myself, what is synthetic data and how is it generated?
Yeah, I think how I always explain it, I think it's the starting point is always we are in the middle of the data revolution, and data-driven solutions like artificial intelligence, business intelligence, software are only as good as the data that they can utilize. And yeah, this is a big challenge. For example, due to the reason that we heard, like privacy, or we do not have data yet. And then you have to have alternatives. So if you can use original data, of course you can use the original data. But if you cannot use the original data, then you have to find alternatives. So, but what is synthetic data? So original data, that is data that you collect in all your interactions with individuals, for example, patients, clients, individuals. On the other hand, synthetic data, that's generated, for example, by an algorithm. So completely artificially generated data. And I think that's the difference. So real data, synthetic data. And what types of synthetic data do exist? So I think, in my opinion, you have two types of synthetic data. On the one hand, synthetic data, what I call simulation generated synthetic data. So you do not have data at all. And you try to generate synthetic data based on assumptions, forecasts with the goal to make scenarios. That's on the one hand, so that's what I call simulation data. On the other hand, that's what we focus on with Syntho. You have original data, and you try to mimic that original data as good as possible. So, for example, you have a data set or a database containing the most privacy-sensitive data. By using algorithms, for example, artificial intelligence, and you can learn all statistics, patterns, and relationships that are in the original data. and thereafter, the algorithm is able to generate completely new and artificially generated data points. But the key difference is that it models and reproduces the same statistics, patterns, and relationships in the generated synthetic data. So that's the second part. You mimic the original data as good as possible as in the synthetic data. And the real value of that is that on data point level, it's fake data, so individuals do not exist. While on data set or database level, you can use it as if it's real data. And this is typically a solution more to overcome data privacy challenges. So some data is highly privacy sensitive, for example, in healthcare, in clinical trials, data that tells everything about patients, health records, clinical trials. You cannot simply use it, share it, or store it. And then as alternative to working with the original data, one can work with the synthetic data. So those are, in my opinion, the two types of synthetic data. So simulation data and a synthetic twin of an original data set. And I think today we're going to deep dive into the do's and don'ts and traps around each of those methods.
I'm part of a working group for clinical research professionals who work in compliance and quality assurance. We have Harvard, University of Iowa, Penn State. And this came up is there are some data you just can't anonymize. Audio data, video data, picture, right? And I was looking on your website. If you haven't yet, I would check out the website. You have a picture of you and then a synthetic you of a human who does not exist. Obviously I understand synthetic data were created, but I was shocked at how real that person is. And so once we created that, you created that. Once we create that, it goes back to why. How does it help us know ourselves, our illnesses, and our society better? And we'll turn to John for this one.
Sure. So I exist on the side of simulation data. And so we're simulating entire populations of people. So we start from, let's say, census data, Department of Bureau of Labor Statistics, Department of Education, all of these large publicly available data sets that might give you data. And like another use case on the synthetic data side is to get a little bit more granular than you might have access to. So you might say there's 7 million people in LA County. What we do is we create 7 million agents that represent the 7 million people. And that's a generated data set. We use a process called iterative proportional fitting to do that. And then so now we have all of these agents. Well, what we then do with those agents is try to make them look more and more like the actual people that live here in LA. So those agents have an age that matches the age distribution all the way down to the census block group level. They have race, they have sex, they have household income, all the way down to the census block group level. So we're going sub-zip code level on this. This data does exist in the census micro data sets, but we're just making it a little bit more granular to look at. So to the question of how we can begin using synthetic data to understand ourselves, understand populations, understand ways to improve the health of populations, we kind of look at this approach in creating something called precision public health. So in the precision medicine world, you might say it's the right treatment for the right patient at the exact right time. In the precision public health world, we're really looking at the right type of policies for that specific population to reach a desired future state of what that population could look like. And one of the things that you have to do is consider the human behavior element of entire populations. And through simulation, you can, and our specific type of simulation is called agent-based modeling. So you have to be explicit about all of the interactions between people and one another, the policies that are enacted on top of those people, and the interactions between people and their environment. And so when you take those three things into consideration, you're able to really understand sort of the social environmental kernel around each individual person. And so the networks that you can create could be simulated networks, but you're doing your best to represent interconnectivity within the household level, interconnectivity between where your kids go to school and everybody else who sends their kids to school at the same place. You're connected through them to other people in their own workplaces. We've effectively reconstructed that kind of physical social network that can be used to then study the spread of respiratory disease, can be used to study other types of epidemics that aren't infectious disease oriented, behavior epidemics, and ultimately to test policies and or test interventions. And I don't want to speak too early on like connecting this to the earlier conversation on like social determinants of health, health equity, or ethics. But one other use case of simulation or synthetic data is to run tests that just would not be ethical to do with people's actual lives. So if you're testing a new intervention, you might want to test that in silicon before you're testing it in reality.
You know, maybe for the third group of people too, when I ask my questions of the audience is it fair then to me, is it fair to think about this like SimCity, like the game SimCity? I remember in the game SimCity, you build a city, you go through all that effort and you put a tornado or you put a UFO and you see what happens to it. It sounds like that to me. How does that relate? And is there a use case that's similar to that?
Certainly. So when you look at the software that we built, you can zoom in, zoom out. You can say, I'm going to look at the entire country. I'm going to look at the state. I'm going to go all the way down to these specific households, these specific workplaces, and these schools. And then you're testing models, you're testing strategies to move the population from one state of being, which is based on the existing data, so built on a real data set, and then saying, well, if we want to improve access to care, how are the ways that we're addressing that? And you're trying to, in the SimCity that, if we're going to use that analogy, you're trying to build the SimCity that produces that outcome. And by using simulation and synthetic data, you can test those things and test like, where are you uncertain about, is this intervention actually going to reach that outcome? Or where within the set of interactions might we need more data? And the one thing that I think has been a challenge in the simulation world and synthetic data world has been, and definitely in agent-based modeling, has been the data, like you can't use real data and bring it into a simulation all that easily when you're running population-driven simulation. So that's like one innovative thing that I could say that we're getting to now that there's more data that's available, the computational power is like caught up. You can run latitude, longitude, household, schools, workplace, behaviors for entire cities, entire states, and countries. So it's a pretty cool thing that you can do with synthetic data that you might not be able to do with all of the data if it's real data.
Thank you, John. And I mentioned to y'all we're going to do a part 1 Q&A. Before we do so, we're going to go through 2 more use cases with Wim Kees and with Dr. Wang, and we'll do our part 1 Q&A. So Wim Kees, let's go to you. What's a use case for synthetic data in clinical trials?
Yep. Yeah, so typically what we see with customers where we work with is that within clinical trials, the data that is collected actually in the clinical trials is highly privacy sensitive. It tells everything about the patients that participated in the clinical trials. And this data cannot simply be used, shared, or stored by anyone that wants to work or should work with the data. I think about data scientists, developers. So therefore, we make sure that we mimic that data to such an extent that it reproduces in the synthetic data. That's why we call it a synthetic data twin, so that those customers can use the synthetic data twin as if it's the real data. And there are big challenges in doing so, because typically the data in clinical trials is highly complex, time series, multi-table databases, all kind of complex structures that should be captured well in the generated synthetic data. And those are the challenges that we need to solve. And of course, we need to demonstrate that the synthetic data, the generated synthetic data is really as good as the real data, especially if one is going to do analytics on the collected clinical trial data. If one is going to do those analytics on the synthetic version of that data, you should really be sure that the synthetic data is highly similar and really mimics the original data. And that's really the big challenge to demonstrate and to make sure that the clients that we work with are really confident with that. I think one use case that I want to share, and I think those are really clinical use cases like organizations that we work with. So we're winner of the Philips Innovation Award. So Philips is a Dutch organization. We're actually here now as part of the CINA Accelerator, where we of course also work with that kind of data. It's always about research. So treatments, trying if there's the control group behaves different than the group that really get like the cure or the treatment. And that's really the use case, to make sure that those customers can have access to the data they need to really do those analytics, both internally, sometimes also by giving access to external companies that are doing the research. And sometimes the data also needs to be shared across entities or across organizations. So sometimes the data is collected in different hospitals, and that data should be collected, for example, by one organization like Philips or another organization that is actually executing the clinical trial. And then you're talking about data sharing. Sharing original data is typically a problem. And then the solution is to make sure that instead of using or sharing the original data, those organizations can use share that synthetic data to make sure that the data is available to do those analytics.
Yeah, I'll even say on the synthetic data side, it can even be used pre-clinical trial. So one of the topics that got brought up in the last session was gaps in access. And if you're not representing the entire population or a better representative of the population, like, is the clinical trial going to get you the right type of results? Is it going to be equitable across the patients that it's going to impact later down the road? So we actually just started working with the National Minority Health Association on this challenge. And the goal is to say, if we're trying to get the right type of recruitment for a clinical trial, how do we know we're able to get the right people recruited for that trial? And so they're able to test how they're marketing to different segments of the population to have a better representation in the clinical trial in the first place. So you're able to test a marketing strategy to get the right people brought in that might have their own reasons why they're unable to sign up for a trial today. But you can test somebody brought up the words counterfactual or during lunchtime. You can test different counterfactuals to say, well, if we go with one strategy over another, who's even going to get recruited or brought into this study? And that can help save money down the road, on the recruitment side. Do you have to redo parts of the trial, that sort of stuff? So I'd want to add that too. Yeah,
and before we turn to Dr. Wang, I'm going to come back to this in part 2. I'm glad this came up about rare diseases and also a preclinical trial. Something that we're looking at Providence is our inclusion-exclusion criteria inclusive, right? Inclusive as in, if we were to do a digital tech and you need an iPhone. iPhones are expensive, they're hard to come by. Is that equitable? Is that inclusive? So that's something that it's tangent to this. It's related to synthetic data, and I'll bring it up again in part 2. So to close out part 1, what is synthetic data and its use cases? Let's go to Dr. Wang. Dr. Wang, and by the way, is Dr. Wang looking at us from here, right?
Right now, yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Wang. So what are other use cases that you can think of?
So I think it's already being mentioned by my other panelists, but I do just want to reemphasize supporting their comment. So we have a couple of cases. One is a cancer, like a drug. So for the cancer drug, it has toxicity, chemo drug. As a result of it, how many people you really want to try on, and how do you actually cover the potential, the variety of kind of people? So that's where we actually use the synthetic data. We actually have a very limited, a very terminally ill and a small population. But after that, we want to use the synthetic data to see what are the effects. We actually changing the dosage, changing the frequency, giving the drug, and then what might be the different courses. So that's related in the AI machine learning. It's called a counterfactual, right? Trying different cases. Second one is also related to, I think what's being brought on early on, is this ethics related, health disparity. So same thing, we're using the counterfactual, the modeling, again, is trying for different group, because the real collected data showing the health disparity. But our goal is in the future to try to address this issue. But you don't want to go back just try on people directly. So how do you do it? You go ahead using the synthetic data modeling to see if you're trying to bring them back, doing the correction there, what's going to be impacting before you do it. So that's why these are some of the real world case we have been working on. So I just want to echo what my panelists have been.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. And we're going to pause here for questions for part one. We'll take 2 questions around 5 minutes. And before we do, I realized in the beginning I said my title. I didn't tell you what's my background. I'll give you my why. So I'm a graduate. I'm an alum of UCLA. Go Bruins. And why it relates to this Q&A, I was a minor in English at UCLA. And William Blake has a quote that I continue to use today: is without contrast, there can be no progression. So, just to encourage you, if there's something maybe that we've talked about you don't fully agree with, or maybe just synthetic data alone, please speak up. And of course, if you have other questions, we welcome them too. Let's try to take 2 of them, if there are any.
Wow. Good morning, everyone. Or is it still morning? It's afternoon. I definitely see the utility in what you guys do. From a lot of my work, I mean, the thing that stands out the most kind of up front is factoring all the contributors to somebody's health, right? So, the uniqueness of their environment, and also like where they come from, where they live, their income, so on and so forth. How do you guys tackle that challenge when you're trying to synthesize data and attribute each individual like to a group within the community? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I can take that one. So when we look at like generating our synthetic population, if you look at the data at the census block level, the zip code level, the county level, we distribute all of the people that are represented in like that stat. That's an agent, and then even in the households, it gets reported on how many households are multi-generational households. So like you're able to get the distribution of that, in the most granular way that we can. It isn't perfect, and it's a representation of that population, and so you can then say, well, we can test these assumptions and say, if this person is a 48-year-old white male in this neighborhood, what is that individual's behavior? And is that individual's behavior different than somebody else that lives 2 or 3 miles away in a different type of neighborhood with a different demographic makeup? It's like all of those things can then be tested, and then you can get into the questions of population health and equity and how one intervention might be appropriate for one segment of a population versus another.
What I see that's really challenging is the multifactorial effects of certain variables. I mean, you'll see it in the dashboards in the back. Mm-hmm. And just to take into account how many inputs you can get to kind of recreate that picture, I think is a really big challenge.
Yeah, the cool thing with like why you might use simulation in this context is because when you're running a simulation, you're going to get very different outcomes each time you run one. So in our approach and like the way that users apply our software, they might run 1,000 simulations of the same model, and they're going to get 1,000 different results. But what they're doing, and I think this kind of gets to one of Dr. Wang's points, is you're trying to narrow your uncertainty around what is the future most likely going to look like. And if you're really using data to make decisions, whether it's real data or synthetic data, you're trying to just have more certainty around, I'm going to make this action. Here's the outcome that I can expect. And that's really the use case for synthetic data in this sense.
It might be going into our panel. Not to kind of continue the last panel, but like if the goal of synthetic data is to be extremely representative of the real data, and you talked about making sure we're kind of filling in those gaps of certain populations, but even if you fill in those gaps, that data can still have that real data can still have bias in it. And health disparities, structural inequalities. So then the synthetic data will have that as well. But how do you mitigate that? How do you think about that when it comes to synthetic data?
So actually, that's a great. So I just want to mention earlier when you had said I appreciated your consideration in the previous panel to hold this question. And John and I looked at each other. We're sitting over there in the corner, just like, oh, we want to ask this question. It's on our list, and I think this is a great segue into the next session. The next part, and we're going to address that. And I think we'll flip our questions around. We'll go with this one first. This is the one we really want to ask. We really want to talk about. And so a little more about me as we go into part two. My background is in clinical trial. So I started as a coordinator, and I've gone through academic centers and nonprofit patient advocate, and now I'm at Providence, and we do multi-ministry clinical trials. And in clinical trial, the topic of equity comes up too, right? The way they select for clinical trial sponsors is appropriate, I think. They go to what they call KOLs, right? Key opinion leaders. They often are working at major institutions. Our hospital is in Santa Monica, one of them, right? It would be very difficult for people living in San Gabriel Valley, where I grew up, to get to. I think Forrest earlier, when I asked him the same question, he was saying, it took him 3 hours. It would take about 2 hours from San Gabriel Valley to Santa Monica during business hours, right? So this topic of equity isn't just going to be solved by this, but I think instinctively, I think there are some things we can do to mitigate, to address this issue. So let's do that first. Let's go with this question.
Yeah, maybe it's a good starting point with the way how we approach it. So our approach is, you have an original data set. We try to mimic it as good as possible in a synthetic data set, which means that if there is a bias in the original data set, that will automatically also be in the synthetic data set. And so if you mimic the original data set as close as possible in the synthetic data set, you will also have a bias. Now, suppose, for example, there's had 30% males, 70% females ratio in the original data set. If you mimic that will also be in the synthetic data set. So there you also have 30% males, 70% females. Now, what you can do with generative AI is you can generate extra males or females to balance that back. And note that is something different than bias mitigation. This is balancing data set, for example, back to the 50% level. Now, the note with this, and I think this is a crucial part of this, is that the extra data points that you are going to generate will be based on that 30% of your original data, which means that you're going to generate more of the same persons. What I always say is you can never forecast the future, and the same accounts for you can never forecast how your missing data would look like. So to that extent, to answer this question, yes, you can balance your data with synthetic data, have from 30%, 37% to 50%, but that will be based on that 30% of the data, and which is balancing, not bias mitigation, which is, I think, the best way in solving this challenge, but really knowing how that missing part of the data that you haven't collected, that is the same as predicting the future. How you can forecast the future, but you're never sure if that's truly going to happen. And that's the same with if you do not have the data, how you can make a prediction or an assumption of how that data would look like, but you're never certain about that. And I think that is the best way, as for now, to what I say, balance data, which is something different than mitigate biases. And I think that's a crucial element in what I see a big misconception in synthetic data generation, that you can use it to actually mitigate all kind of biases. To some extent, that offers a solution.
Yeah, two of the people on the earlier panel, Forrest and Lisa, brought up like this kind of bias question as well. And you do the best you can with it. And like using Forrest's like kind of framework, or Lisa's, I think, brought it up more so, when that data is like a structural part of like how it's collected, when it's a structural part of society, all of that sort of stuff, it's going to be in, let's say it's pervasive in all of the data sets. But then what you can possibly do is to say, well, if we don't want these biases to be there in the future, what do we think must be true then? And you're going to test some assumptions that could help you get to that future state where maybe when you are collecting data at the next census, it isn't going to be as biased. And that can be done through simulating behavior interactions to say, like, what we know about the past, we want to change it. How can we change it? How do we think behaviors might be changing and evolving over time? That might be one way to address bias, but this is a really big question. RAND, MITRE, RTI, a lot of like big research organizations are trying to solve this. But I think to Lisa and Forrest's comments, like until we solve those more societal structural things, it's still going to be there.
And Dr. Wang, any thoughts on this?
Oh yeah, I want to actually make a comment about bias. In terms of bias, there's so many kind of bias in this entire data engineer, data science community, AI community. Some are related to data collection bias. Some are related when you're doing the model bias. But more importantly, there are also some bias, even it's completely done by human being, the expert. There's something called a confirmation bias. That bias was biased by their knowledge, right? So what I want to mainly trying to say is, when we're trying to model the things, we try to model things we do not know what we do not know. It's actually very hard to say we are going to prevent that. So part of the strategy is, in fact, we need to be being aware about there are those unknown bias. There are also those implicit bias. It's embedded in the data collection process, embedded in the experimental design process, embedded in the model development process. So if we are being aware of that, then there's a chance we can actually break out from that loop in the process. But honestly, we don't have absolutely zero bias in any sense, because implicit bias is always going to be there, right? It's only about how we're going to address it. I mentioned this largely because part of the issue currently, when we're trying to first do at this moment, is trying to extend the data beyond the constraint limitation we have, such as privacy constraints, such as rare disease, the number of sample availability, such as you don't want to use the human life for the test, right? So while we're doing that, the principle is the first step is trying create a synthetic data representative of what you already have and you already know. You do not want to upfront come here, change the distribution. For example, model using the early data. Most of them actually turn out to be wrong. Right? It doesn't fit the later on while we learn more of those. So, but what we need to do though is being open-minded about while we're doing it, giving the flexibility in fixing it while we're gaining more knowledge. So that's one thing I just want to share. Because it happened to
Thank
be
you,
one
Dr.
of the
Wang.
main
You know, I have to
topics.
say this
I am
conversation
meeting.
is difficult for me because I'm a natural optimist learning to be a pessimist. I've learned that that's the way to balance it out. So, you know, when Todd approached me about, hey, what about this topic? I was like, yes, there's something here. We got to explore it. And I think this conversation is difficult because y'all are so balanced in this conversation about what could go wrong, which is the title of this. I want to go, yes, let's go. Let's deep dive. Right. When I was a coordinator, I got to deep dive into patients' lives. I got to know them. I got to know their behaviors. And I realized often that isn't captured in the electronic medical record. It's not. We don't write that. Right. Our format is SOAP, SOAP, subjective, objective, assessment, and plan. And that really goes into it. And I think this topic of how synthetic data can help us understand our behavior, that's what gets me excited. And I think that for me is what I look forward to learning more about. I mean, I want to ask a question, but before I do, I just want to know who here is still skeptical or is skeptical, have been skeptical about synthetic data? Okay, great. You're my people. You're my people right now. So, you know, the topic today is what could go wrong, synthetic data in clinical trial. And we were talking earlier, you know, Dr. Wang, in your introduction, you mentioned rare diseases. It's very hard. It's very difficult to enroll patients in rare diseases, right? And, you know, we talk about preclinical trials and maybe being able to predict if a drug will work in the real patient population. And so then, well, let's think through that. So is there a case where a drug, let's say a drug really would work in a rare disease patient population, but the synthetic data show that it wouldn't? You know, if you take, I'm thinking maybe there's some Bayes statistics involved, like priors. You take prior rare diseases in this field have all failed, let's say Alzheimer's. How do we make sure, how do we guard against that? I know we can't solve it, but how do we guard against it?
Yeah, maybe to start on that, I think what I would say, there are three big challenges when working with synthetic data in clinical trials, and we have them with every case. And the three are data privacy, data accuracy, and ease of use. So let's start with the first one, data privacy. So the concept is simple. Synthetic data completely artificially generated, so individuals do not exist. But how to prove that and how to make sure that you actually do not accidentally generate real data in your synthetic data. So I think that's a big risk when generating synthetic data, for example, with some of the more open source packages that are in the market. Some can, for example, overfit, and that's a risk within AI and machine learning. If you overfit, then you can coincidentally generate real data in your synthetic data. So that's a really important one to make sure that you cover in your algorithm, but also in some kind of privacy assessment. We have various distance-based measures to really demonstrate that overfitting didn't happen, and of course have that included in the software as well. Now the second one, and that comes to your point about if you draw conclusions on analytics on the synthetic data, can you really trust this? So that's the second part. So you really should be able to demonstrate that the data is accurate in comparison to the real data, and also in the more complex cases when you talk with when you work with time series data, large multi-table databases, really complex data structures. You really should make sure that you can capture those patterns as well, and you really have to have advanced matrices in your data accuracy assessments to make sure that you actually have the data accuracy that you need for your analytics. So that's the second one. Really make sure that you assess on that. We do that with a data accuracy report. And also we have a collaboration with SAS. That's an analytics company that assesses our synthetic data on a regular basis by their data experts. So they assess the synthetic data really with all kind of machine learning models, train them, compare that with original data and see if the results are similar. So I think that's the second one. And the third one, synthetic data generation, really mimicking original data as good as possible, is complex and difficult. So it will take you a lot of time to do this by yourself. You have various methods to do it with generative adversarial networks. You have other packages that can do that. And they will all perform different on different data set and in different use cases. So to get to the point that you can actually work with synthetic data, you really need to go through that process to really understand what you're doing, because otherwise it will take you a lot of time. So coming back to your questions, I would say those are the big challenges where one that starts with synthetic data should really focus on. So really make sure that you can actually guarantee the privacy, make sure that you can have the data accuracy that you need for your use case, also for the most complex data structures, and make sure that you do not waste a lot of time on doing so, because it will be difficult. So that will be my answer on what could go wrong, one of them.
The other thing that goes wrong in like the simulation side of this conversation is all the data is being used to ultimately make a decision. And it comes down to when that decision is wrong, what are the consequences? And understanding that at the population level, it's not just one thing that could go wrong. There's going to be cascading impacts, specifically when we're talking about entire populations of people. So this gets back to trusting a model. How do you validate it? How do you verify it's doing what you expect it to? Being explicit about your assumptions. These are all things that can be done as preventative ways to not have a model that gives you a wrong decision, but you're not going to predict exactly what happens in reality. Like the real data, you can look backwards and you can say, this is exactly what happened. Well, maybe some things weren't collected. It's like having real versus synthetic data to make a decision. And there's challenges in both, but ultimately it comes down to decision making. And the worst thing that could go wrong is you're impacting the health and livelihoods of millions of people.
Dr. Wang, we turn to you before we go into Q&A for this part. What are your thoughts?
What I said is I totally agree with both my panelists, and I have the same opinion on this. The worst case scenario is when you actually design the getting the synthetic data, even you emulated the original data, it happened to be starting with the wrong assumption of under the wrong constraint, and then it lead to if the result that's opposite to the best potential real outcomes. That's the danger, which actually unfortunately does happen. In fact, some of the early vaccine development read in the report that's actually was based on the initial pilot study extrapolated, but when put on the real the production, it caused more adverse effect being discovered later. So those are definitely the danger. It's definitely related to our limitation in terms of knowledge, understanding, as well as the modeling piece. So that's why I agree with my two panelists.
We talked about what could go wrong. Before we go to Q&A, I think I'll end with our final question, concluding question. And there's a quote I like. It's by an English writer, Edwin Markham. It said, "Great it is to believe the dream as you stand in youth by the starry stream. But a greater thing to fight life through and say at the end the dream is true." So what would be your dream use case for synthetic data?
Yeah, so for me, and that's really our mission is really to unlock the data we need to actually build the data-driven solutions we need at the moment, for example, in clinical trials to save lives. That's our mission, to make sure that we have the data that we need to build those solutions. Yeah, that's our mission, and that's why we're of course here. And this is not only in healthcare; this is across all sectors, in banking, in energy, in telecom. The challenges are everywhere. They are all the same. They all need data. Without data, it will not happen. So we're really on a mission to make sure that we can unlock that data for everyone.
I'm going to use the word unlock as well. It's kind of unlocking the power of simulation for synthetic data. And in this specific use case, I'm going to draw on a note that Forrest said earlier, and I'm going to steal it, health equity by design. So if you're able to say, these are the outcomes we hope that we can achieve for a specific population, to use synthetic data to help you drive decisions and strategies that help you get there, that would be the dream use case.
Yeah, for me, I must say, because I'm in the biomedical engineering field, so what we have been through together through this COVID pandemic had taught me a big lesson, and a lot of us big lessons. We're not prepared. So if you ask me for my current dream, my dream is we need to be prepared for the next unexpected major health crisis happening to us by utilizing the existing one, building a model so we can be more prepared in dealing with all unknowns.
Thank you all very much. And so to help us at Providence prepare, let's unlock your questions.
Thanks, Todd. Hi, thank you so much for that. I've been thinking about how to phrase this comment / question, because if we look at the COVID-19 pandemic as an example, technology was never the problem. Our scientific capabilities were never the problem. It was the thick layer of the solution that we missed out on was actually the art of delivery. And so when you think about this particular topic, if you think about synthetic data, where are the guardrails and the boundaries around what we should be absolutely using this for, and what actually this can contribute to but cannot drive?
Maybe to come back to your COVID example. So I think that was the perfect example that over the world in every country data was collected around cures and treatments and COVID tests and results. But they were all collected locally. So in each country, different institutes, decentralized, and that data was all stored on those locations, never shared, never utilized to actually work together to make sure that we can analyze that data to maybe find something. Whoever knows, if we have had like one big data lake with all COVID data from for all over the world that could be utilized by, for example, one medical group or whatever to do all kind of analytics on that. So I think that's the example where data sharing and all the discussions around what we could have done with the data and what we missed there as opportunity because the data was simply locked in all kind of locks over all kind of locations. So I think that's one classical example. It's actually a clinical trial case, but then like globally. To the other question, where not to use it for, I think that's more the question how I always phrase it. So we utilize synthetic data to solve data privacy challenges, and you can use it for all kind of use cases to do analytics on. But the simple example is it is synthetic data. What I always say, if you are going to invoice your customers, don't do that with synthetic data because they're not going to pay it. They are not going to pay your invoices, right? So, I mean, it works if you're talking about analytics, business intelligence, those kind of use cases. But really, for operational use cases, you will always need original data, and that this is a solution what will not solve that. So, there are a lot of use cases where you can use synthetic data for, but there are also a lot of use cases where it will not help for example, the one I mentioned.
On the COVID-19 example, it's a really great use case for testing the what if scenarios. So what if one vaccine is less effective than another before it's rolled out? What if waning immunity is different in one age group versus another? All of those questions are scenarios that we would hope decision makers that are looking out for the health of entire populations are able to ask. And those things can only be done by using synthetic data. So in testing the what ifs, great use case for it. I'm not going to come up with a wittier example of how not to, so I'm going to pass.
Hi, Tim McLaren of Medical Intelligence One. So are you guys familiar with the game Telephone? That's kind of what it feels like to me, thinking about running studies on synthetic data. And I feel like I'd rather just get to what information did you glean from the original data that allowed you to synthesize this data? Can I just go to that? Can you just tell me what's the distribution in this, group of patients or something like that? That feels a little bit less like playing telephone to me. Yeah. Do you make that available? Is that part of your?
Yeah, maybe to answer that, I think the techniques that we use simply do not work like that. So it's not an algorithm that has a certain list of business rules that will reproduce them in the synthetic data. So therefore, this is something we unfortunately cannot do. So it's an algorithm that learns the statistics, patterns, and relationships. And the rule of thumb is the stronger the statistical pattern, the better it will be reproduced in the synthetic data. And that will include all patterns that there are in the data, but also all patterns that you even don't know that are in the data. They will all be reproduced in the synthetic data. And you have to take it from there. And we support all kind of quality assurance to demonstrate certain patterns, correlations, etc. But it's not that we provide you a list with, hey, this is where you should look at. Something that is used, so we have a correlation matrix. It's also illustrate the correlations in the original data, correlations in the synthetic data. Some of our customers use it to see what are the strongest correlations so that they can use that as starting point. And I think that might be something that can be interesting as referred to your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so our world, I really like the telephone example. And so when we run a forecast through simulation, we can then calibrate back to existing data. So we check how well we're doing at playing the game telephone along the way. So like when we're calibrating a model, we might say, okay, we're going to start the simulation for COVID as an example in June of 2020. And how well did it perform across 2020 to present? And we can go backwards to recalibrate different, we actually look at the contact rate and contact patterns as like the biggest driver of what moves the epidemic forward, because it's really a proxy for human behavior and how many interactions are happening with any given population. So that's the one variable that we end up calibrating and adjusting the model for. So there are tools, and like it really depends on the use case though. So like in our use case, we can calibrate to real world data because we're representing every person there already. When you're not representing every person in the data, it's tough to do that same sort of calibration technique. But definitely want to follow up on this after the session.
Yeah, the fun thought is it'd be interesting with that example. If we play the game of telephone all the way to Tel Aviv and back, AI is cool, and it comes back, AI is drool or something like that. That's something that we would have to guard against, is when it comes back to us, to make sure it's not too far from what we were discussing in tone, in intention, in meaning. So what else? I think we'll take one more question.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Very informative. So I was wondering what kind of maybe qualifications you provide to your customers when you're using synthetic data. So for example, like if you suspect maybe the data is fat-tailed and then estimates of like the parameters of the distribution will never converge, you kind of maybe stay in the loop with them on that and kind of keep retraining your model as you go? Or do you kind of give them like a set of qualifications that they shouldn't use this data for? What does that kind of look like on the business side?
Yeah. So indeed, in principle, if you generate every time, it will be a different synthetic data set. So you can always, if something goes wrong, you can also regenerate it and check if it's better. So the quality measures are really starting from the basic, like the distributions, correlation matrix, then also the bivariate distribution correlations, etc. So that's the combination between variables. Specifically for those, we also show the discrepancy. So for example, with correlations, we has the correlations between -1 and +1. So we show the discrepancy. So a rare case, if the one is -1 and the other is +1, which you of course never will have, then you get a 2, and it's sorted from top to bottom. And of course, we want to minimize them. And next to that, we have machine learning models that trained on the original synthetic data, like random forest, gradient boosting, regressions, neural networks. They're also in the quality report where you have to define a predictor, so a variable that you want to forecast. We work with holdout sets to actually make it better comparable to or more equal. So we also include the results of the performance of those machine learning models, where we compare on original data, synthetic data, same models, same predictor, and where we show the area under the curve, for example. And those are on the data accuracy side. And yeah, if you have a data set, for example, more than happy to run it through it and make sure that you can see it by yourself. And then you can do all kind of analytics that you want to do as well. Because we can, of course, say whatever we want to do here, but it's better seeing as believing. So I think that can, for example, be an interesting one. Also because you mentioned that you're skeptical. So invited to see it as well by yourself.
Wim, Kees, John, Dr. Wang, it's been a pleasure and it's been humbling to get to know y'all and dive into this. I made a promise. Our promise at Providence is know me, care for me, ease my way. I love to get to know y'all after this session. Happy to get to know what you're working on. And maybe there's something that's similar to what we're thinking too at Providence. But thank you all very much for your attention and for your engagement. Cheers.
Thank you.